Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion topic video. So in this one I want to talk about Netflix Avatar and specifically about Omashu and how it's going to be used in the live action, because I think this is probably a set piece that they're going to be using where a lot of episodes are going to be crammed into this one. A lot more than is there in the original is going to be made out of this episode, and I just want to kind of discuss it and just get this out there and see what people think overall, because I haven't necessarily fully seen what people have been fully predicting for like what episodes are where, which characters are going to be used in which episodes. So I do maintain that I think the Omashu stuff is going to be the key to figuring out quite a bit, because some of the other stuff I think is very clear, like 2 episodes here in the Northern Water Tribe to do the finale makes sense. This one of course is going to be, I guess, mostly made up of the Blue Spirit episode plus probably some other stuff. This one of course very clearly is going to be our Winter Solstice kind of 2-parter focusing on the whole Heibai plot, some Spirit World stuff I guess, and Aang meeting Roku. Makes sense. Opening episode, of course, I'm guessing is going to be the first, 3 episodes probably together. Plus, we don't know how long the opening kind of flashback sequence for the first Sozin's Comet, like Gyatso versus Sozin, is going to be. So there could be quite a lot crammed into this episode. Warriors, of course, is our Kyoshi Warriors episode. Be interested to see like if they include any of like Southern Air Temple in at the start of this one before we arrive, because if it is a quite extended sequence for the Sozin's, the attack on the Southern Air Temple here, I'm a little bit worried that like some of the early stuff might get a little bit be rushed past a little bit too quickly. Whereas Warriors, of course, just focusing on like 104, even extended with some extra Kyoshi focus, still feels like there's probably a little bit more to do here. They're obviously going to make more out of, I guess, Zhao's occupation of the place, how Zuko gets involved in things. You'll have, I think, a little bit more side plotty style stuff going on in all of this. And that's going to be I think the real, probably like interesting, maybe surprising kind of aspect of all of this. But then we get to Omashu, which of course in the original 105 it's a really good episode, but it's mainly like this hilarious episode that has some important stuff in terms of like the reveal that like Boomie is actually from Aang's, like he's that old that he is Aang's friend from the past. He tells Aang that like Ozai is the one you will need to defeat in the end, but ultimately it's not the most significant episode from a plot point of view, but it's clear from the trailers that Omashu is where they're including a lot of the changes. Straight away, one of the really obvious ones is that Teo and the Mechanist from episode 17 of the original show, the Northern Air Temple, they're being rolled into this episode here. Then some other stuff that we have here is that clearly some explosions go off at some point in Omashu with everything happening. When does that happen? What does that suggest? And this is probably where we get into the heavy speculation of, I'm beginning to feel, or I felt this way for a while, that are we getting Omashu taken over by the Fire Nation in this season? As in, they're basically bringing up some of Return to Omashu into this episode. Or at least they're giving us the potential backstory about why, when you arrive in 203 and see that the city's been taken, we're showing that a little bit more up front. That our gang will probably leave at the end of this episode, seeing that things are going bad, they have to make their escape, and this is what goes into this. I think, to a certain degree, I think this is a 2-parter in Omashu. Because I think the Into the Dark, based on, not this, here. These screenshots, I think this is from the full trailer. When do we have an underground sequence where like the characters have been through a lot and they have a kind of reunion type thing? I get the impression Into the Dark is to a certain degree some sort of a like reverse Cave of Two Lovers type situation, whereas instead of having to kind of go through the mountain passage to get in a way into or near Omashu, they're using a similar type thing to get out of Omashu to escape the conflict that's happening, because it's happening earlier here than it is in the original. Now the big question here is, like, is Azula leading this attack? Because we know there is Azula stuff, that we know Azula is going to be with Mai and Ty Lee at a certain point of the season, but does that happen early on? Does it happen later? Because we're being told that, like, the Azula stuff is this kind of prequel, kind of lead into her story in book 2, but then it also comes across as if it's very clearly, like, extra stuff. Like, it's just, it's not just a prequel, but like we're moving some of the Azula stuff to just kind of happen earlier also. So I don't know, are we maybe suggesting that Azula leads the attack in Omashu? Because of course you have the scene of Azula drawing a bow and arrow, and we don't know where that's necessarily taking place. I find that one very hard to predict, of like, is Azula just in the Fire Nation up until like the very end and then she kind of comes into play? Or what? Do we have the gang focused around Omashu here, but then like Azula can go basically to Omashu in these episodes when the gang isn't around? A lot of what we don't know about, like, just stuff relating to those characters that are being kind of moved around a little bit, it makes it kind of complicated to see what happens. But I do think very clearly these two episodes are interlinked, that Omashu is basically getting this really weird mix of like 105. I think there's going to be a bit of 106 in here. Obviously, Northern Air Temple stuff is in here with like Teo and the Mechanist. So there's a lot of bits and pieces, I think, that is going into this episode. Whereas my logic with the 106 stuff, the imprisoned stuff, is not that I'm saying that Haru and Tyro are going to be in this episode, but that I think Omashu is going to kind of represent that idea of kind of the Earthbenders rebelling, or the actually bring up the idea that the Earth Kingdom is actually actively fighting the Fire Nation, which doesn't get brought up as much as you'd think in the original. And I think they're probably just going to highlight that Omashu and Ba Sing Se are the two last big Earth Kingdom cities that haven't fallen yet. There's some weird stuff around Ba Sing Se where it's not as active as you'd think, and it's maybe a little bit of a teaser for the whole conspiracy. There's no war within the walls situation. And so Omashu is going to be the main city in terms of that's actively supplying the Earth Kingdom army and actively helping what's going on in the war. And I think they're going to probably emphasize that a little bit with what's going on here. We'll get to that in a second, but like, it is interesting that in the Bringing the World to Life, we did see this random Earthbender character, and I don't know where this is. It might be Omashu at nighttime, maybe when the attack has come in, the defenders desperately defending against the Fire Nation as it comes in to take Omashu. But we have some sort of an earthbending kind of situation going on here. They obviously have placed a lot of importance on making Omashu look absolutely stunning, but we have to see what's happening here. Now, based on what we've seen, of course, we've seen some footage of like their arrival into Omashu. We have seen some footage of the Aang versus Boomie fight, suggesting that yes, we're getting, I'm guessing, we'll see most of the beats of actual 105 take place. They'll do this, they'll have the fun stuff of Boomie being a weird character, the reveal that it is actually a 112-year-old Boomie, I guess, is going to come out. But because that's a 22-minute episode, and this is going to be like an hour-long episode, we're going to be at that point early-ish in this episode. And so after that, I think you do have to get into the idea of some sort of an attack comes in. There's more to it than this. Plus, you have to acknowledge the idea that I don't think they're just going to have Katara and Sokka just be in Genomite the whole episode, just as like it's an Aang-focused episode with Boomie, and the other two are just like in this jokey kind of gem rock candy thing. So they have to have their own plots. Very clearly, Sokka and the Mechanist are being paired up for this episode. The air power plot point from 117 is going to come into play here, which I think links into the idea that if the Fire Nation takes Omashu, this is how they get access to the Mechanist and Sokka's ideas for like war balloons and warships and stuff like that. I think that does make quite a bit of sense. The other thing I would maybe be wondering about is to keep Katara in play a little bit. Is Omashu, when we see the three characters maybe have three separate plots, where Sokka has his stuff with the Mechanist, Aang has his stuff with Boomie. Is Katara's stuff with Jet? Is Jet being brought into Omashu? Because I find it very hard otherwise to place where Jet is actually going to be used within the series. Because the Blue Spirit stuff, you might think there might be some connection there, but like the scenes that we've seen from the trailers are clearly, all of them are focused on Katara and Jet. Now, there could still be a side plot where while Aang is captured, this happens with Jet here. And I don't think I can say for certain that like the background in this shot or this shot is Omashu for certain. But if there is going to be a sense of like we're highlighting the Earth Kingdom fighting against the Fire Nation, this would be the first major time where we're going to maybe see some of that stuff happen. And that would be an interesting plot point to have, that maybe Jet and his gang see the attack coming first. Katara has to rush back, and as she arrives and meets up with the rest of the gang, the city does get attacked. And it starts to fall because it is maybe Azula who's leading the attack. Because otherwise, like, this is an episode that, like, it doesn't feature really Zhao. It doesn't feature Zuko. Because it's more of a one-off fun episode focused on Boomie as a new character. What are those characters going to be up to? I'm guessing in the middle of all of this, like, you're going to maybe... I'm assuming this is probably in or around where you'll have the whole... Iroh gets captured by the Earth Kingdom soldiers and stuff like that, and play on the whole idea of, while we're seeing the Fire Nation take over an Earth Kingdom city, we're seeing our other kind of group of characters deal with Earth Kingdom soldiers, you know, that sort of idea, that duality. That could be a really interesting way to do it, because obviously 106 is a more Katara focused episode, and if you just completely remove out all aspects of that, you do take that away. But if you bring in 110 and link the Jet story sort of into maybe sort of the Earth Kingdom rebellion, Earth Kingdom fighting in the war aspect, you allow Katara to have some focus in this episode. I think that makes sense to a certain degree. Now, the question, obviously, when we go into the Dark, which, again, is, I'm assuming is happening because that's such a bombastic episode, and I think so much is going to happen in Omashu that the escape from Omashu, I think, is probably going to have to be a bit of a plot point to itself. So, Into the Dark, I'm assuming, is effectively some sort of a reverse, like, Cave of Two Lovers. But then I find it very hard to predict, like, what else there really is, because the other episodes covered here, obviously, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you basically have, I think, 5, 6 here. Spirited Away is obviously going to be like 7 and 8. So it is this weird kind of like gap episode where there's nothing from the other episodes necessarily to fit in here, really, really obviously. Unless this is a two-parter. And again, let's not over-focus on the titles here in terms of like Into the Dark. Like, this episode will start with them in the caves and stuff like that. No, we can have like 1.5 episodes be the introduction to Omashu, the King Boomie stuff, maybe the introduction of like the Mechanist, Teo, Jet. The start of this episode can still be the continuation of that, and maybe the introduction of like stuff is going wrong. That Into the Dark is both, we have to escape through the caves, but also that the darkness is entering, coming into Omashu. So this could be like this plus, you know, maybe elements of 106, 117, and 110 all together. That could be like an interesting way to do it, because I think it does create this kind of central focus of the season, which, as you travel through the world, basically, because you go from South Pole to North Pole, I think you have to acknowledge the overall conflict of the Earth Kingdom being the force fighting against the Fire Nation, and that the fall of Omashu, which happens off screen, is a huge point in the war. So I think the gang leaving and basically knowing something bad has happened to Omashu is a reasonable plot point, just because it is sort of unclear from like early book 2 how much of those earlier episodes are maybe going to be used. Because if this is the case, and maybe we're bringing that all into place, like we'll see Omashu basically become new Ozai, and you have like Azula with Mei and Ty Lee there, all that stuff is in position ahead of 203. But because you've done it up front, it means you don't have to do it in book 3. So you're maybe removing like episode 2, episode 3, and potentially some of episode like 5, Avatar Day, if Warriors is like 104 and 205. Like that's the kind of the key point here, is that then going into from book 1 into book 2, the early part of book 2 is also a little bit scattered with its episodes until you properly activate the plot as you get into the sort of library, the desert, into Ba Sing Se, and that's where the plot truly comes into play. Before that, like, you are a little bit all over the place. We're over here with General Fong, and then we're in Omashu for 2 episodes, and then we're in the swamp, and then we're back on Kyoshi and Chin Village, and you know, we're finally doing the introduction of Toph. Zuko alone happens, and because of certain other scenes, it feels like maybe some elements of Zuko alone are being brought forward in here, maybe to give more backstory in maybe an episode like Masks, or wherever they decide to do backstories, because I'm guessing episodes, say like The Storm, that backstory content is just going to be spread out across multiple episodes on Aang and Zuko's side of things. And because they have the context of knowing that like backstory gets revealed about various characters in later seasons, they can bring that forward, because they're doing it with other material about like the past avatars, so they can do it with other stuff as well. So the core point I want to talk about in this video, I'll have another point in just a second, is just Omashu, and basically this idea of how much do you think happens in Omashu? How many of these characters that we know are in the show, how much of it is taking place in or around episode 3 and 4? And I think I especially want to know, because clearly something chaotic happens in Omashu. I may be leaning too much into the like Azula attacks Omashu, but I'm guessing something happens. Like, they could have those explosions basically just be caused by like the Mechanist, that like when they're talking to Teo, an explosion happens, the Mechanist has blown himself up, and this is how we maybe meet the Mechanist or something like that. It could be a complete thing that maybe doesn't particularly matter, but I do think very clearly this episode has to be some sort of a like flight from Omashu type situation here. So I really do want to know in the comments what your guys' thoughts are on. A lot of it comes down to like what you think episode 4 is, just because its positioning means that like it doesn't really have an equivalent episode, and then what extra stuff is being added onto Omashu. A little bit more on this. So obviously this is 107 and 108. So my interesting thing with this is I'm very interested to see, will this be an expansion on the kind of concept? Because this is the introduction of the spirit world in 107 in the animation. But we don't see the spirit world. Heibai takes the people that he takes Sokka to the spirit world, but we never see the spirit world. Aang's spirit is separated from his body. His spirit is still in the physical world. Aang doesn't actually go to the spirit world in this episode. So it's a quite complicated dynamic when you reflect back on it. That doesn't particularly show off the ideas of the spirit and the spirit world too well. Heibai's in, so that's good. But I'm assuming they'll make this a little bit clearer and use this as an opportunity to show off the spirit world, because unlike 107, where it maybe had a little bit of early series, we don't know exactly what all the lore is. They know what the lore is. They know what the spirit world is like very clearly. they can show it off if required. And if you're devoting a whole episode to just 2 episodes, you need a bit of expansion, and I think exploring the spirit world in search of whoever it is gets taken, if they still do the Sokka gets taken plot, is, I think, a reasonable way to actually do this. And then I'm guessing at some point in here, Aang becomes alerted to the fact that he needs to go to Crescent Island, which we know is happening. We see a shot of Aang gliding onto Crescent Island. We have an actor who's playing a Fire Sage. We have an actor who's playing Roku. Something along the lines of that is going to happen here, but it's going to be different because of the Comet. We know about from the interviews, the Comet is the information that Aang is going to get from Roku is going to change. It seems like going into this episode, he already knows he has to be somewhat quick about doing his role as the Avatar, because the implication is that Aang will know already that the Comet is what the timeline is, but he doesn't know what the timeline of the Comet is. But they're not revealing that to him in Season 1 because they don't know when they're filming Season 2 and 3. They don't want to say the Comet comes in 1 year, but they're only filming Season 3 3 or 4 years from now, and that just doesn't make any sense because the actors are going to look so much older. So they're holding back on that information to reveal it, I guess, later on down the line when they more clearly know when everything is happening with regards to the actors' ages. So it creates this question of, what's Roku actually going to tell Aang? What prompts Aang to so desperately go to the Fire Nation, go into enemy territory on a whim, basically, just to speak to Roku? Why does this need to happen if he's not actually getting the key information? And this makes me think of like, well, clearly in the Kyoshi Warrior episode, they're going to bring in Kyoshi stuff that we learn from later on. Clearly, Avatar Karuk is coming into play in these Northern Water Tribe episodes. Are they going to bring in some of the stuff about 306, so the Avatar and the Fire Lord, the backstory of Roku and Sozin, the backstory of the war? Because we're going to start off with a big flashback sequence, we don't know how long it's going to be, but they're highlighting it quite a bit, so it's probably a pretty major sequence here. We're going to see Sozin, we're going to see Gyatso. What about Roku? Like, what about his side of things to kind of inform Aang potentially about what has happened on that side of things? Will they bring that information up? Because in the show, it's a really cool late series reveal, but it is often surprising when you get to Season 3 and you're 6 episodes in and you realize, like, oh yeah, we've only just now found out why the war started. So I'm wondering, will some of the Roku information just be effectively Kyoshi will talk to Aang about her struggles as being the Avatar, her regrets or whatever, mistakes as the Avatar. Roku will maybe do the same here, and that would prompt some of the telling of that story. Of course, not the full thing, but at least some of it. And I'm interested to see how that goes, just to see how that all plays out. Because I do worry a little bit that the significance of Roku's scene be a little bit undercut here, because he's going to go from being like the one past life in book 1 to now he's going to be one of 3 past avatars that will meet in this version of the show. We're going to have Kyoshi here, Karuk down here, and then Roku will maybe not even be doing his full role from the original. So I hope they don't diminish him too much, because he's meant to be the significant avatar for Aang because he's the one directly before him. And then I suppose I'll wrap it up here with masks, because I don't think there's too much to say about the Northern Legends. It's going to be 118, 119, 120 with Karuk extension scenes to add in extra context, extra details, and who knows, maybe a little bit more expansion beyond that, depending on what exactly we do. But certainly we've not seen a ton of stuff about the Northern Water Tribe, but we know a lot of it's going to still be there. Especially stuff about like the finale. We don't really know when it comes to, like, is Koizilla going to be in here? Are we going to see that merger of Aang in the Avatar state with the ocean spirit? How much of the Zuko stuff with Zhao is going to be in here? Because one of my, in addition to not knowing exactly where Azula is going to be, I'm actually a little bit confused about how heavily involved Zhao is going to be throughout the season, where it's clear he's like going to be used here, that's a new introduction of Zhao. It's clear he's probably going to play a role in Masks in relation to the Blue Spirit stuff, and of course in the finale. I'm a little bit unclear about, like, say, like, I guess it would have to be the first episode. It could be part of the second episode because Zuko and Zhao are now in the same area. Where is the Zuko Zhao Agni Kai taking place? Is it taking place? Are we getting that? Because the first episode comes across as being a little bit packed. It means that maybe the second episode has some time to do that. But that almost seems a little bit complicated. That Zhao's going to be attacking Kyoshi, everyone's going to be counterattacking, Zuko's going to be there trying to take advantage. Is there time to do Zuko versus Zhao? How much of that rivalry is going to be a focus across the season? Especially given that it doesn't seem like Zhang Zhang has an actor. He's probably not in here, potentially. You're potentially losing some Zhao stuff, but maybe adding in some extra, like, mechanic stuff about him and how to kill a spirit in relation to these last two episodes. I wonder how that will play out. Which then brings us to the last bit of the discussion here. Masks. What is this one going to be? Very clearly, it's going to be 113. I'm assuming they'll probably also include some flashback stuff here as well. To explain and introduce potentially the idea of Zuko as the Blue Spirit, I think they're going to potentially use this as a pretty significant backstory style moment to give you the context of, like, hey, Zuko's a firebender, but he's actually, at this point, more skilled with swords than he is as a firebender. Why is that the case? And so I'm wondering, do they bring 207 in? Zuko alone. Some of that backstory information. Because this takes place in season 2 because, in a way, they only got around to figuring this stuff out in the original in season 2. They now have that to play with, and they've said comments along the lines of, like, we'll bring up stuff as required in relation to, like, other material. Backstory stuff, I think, is very much the case, and especially when I think in this trailer, I think it is, yeah, we have this interesting Ozai scene where he replies as if he's being questioned by someone. And the only person I could ever imagine he would speak this way to would be his father, Azulon. And this is potentially backstory stuff. But it seems like he's still wearing, like, Fire Lord kind of regalia. So, I don't know, he might just be responding to someone who slightly questions him. Maybe this is part of the Zuko backstory. Does Zuko question him? Did they bring up that aspect a bit? A little bit unclear. But, okay, the Blue Spirit's going to happen. You're going to get your big action set piece, but that's not going to fill up an entire hour. So the question is obviously, like, do they link these two episodes together, like, at all? Like, is Aang and the gang going to get away at the end of this episode, or what if Aang gets captured at the end of this? Because, like, it's a little bit confusing because we obviously don't have a lot of scenes from maybe the later half of the series where, like, it seems like maybe Aang goes to the Fire Temple on his own. As we see in one of the clips, he seems to glide in on his own. Or does he just scout ahead of time and the rest are just on Appa behind? Because if he's captured here, this would allow Sokka and Katara to have a separate plot of their own somewhere else. And maybe Jet, instead of happening in Omashu, maybe Jet is actually where Masks happens. Just this is the plot point for Sokka and Katara during this episode. That's a bit of an interesting one for me to see where exactly that all takes place. And then because Jet is a character who will ultimately kind of be recurring, he's going to come back in a big way in season 2. Maybe Jet's like here, and here. Like, you can't rule any of that out just because, like, he is going to be a recurring character. You know, the Mechanist and Teo will come back, of course, as well. But Jet is the more kind of significant character overall. Maybe part of the setup for this episode is also, maybe this is where June is as well. So 115, the stuff with June and Nyla. Maybe this is how they track down Aang, regardless of how he ends up getting captured. Is it like Nyla captures him? That's one way to do it. That would make sense. Because are they going to randomly introduce the Yuyan archers? But then Azula's firing a bow and arrow at one point in one of the trailers. Is she the one who ends up capturing Aang randomly, maybe without knowing who he is initially? There's so many different ideas about some of this stuff. But I think what's very clear is just that, like, the beginning and end, pretty set in stone. Potentially even the second episode, Warriors, feels relatively clear what they're doing. Episode 5 feels, I think, relatively clear. But 3 and 4, and also episode 6, like the full extent of what's going to make up these episodes, I'm very intrigued by, just because we don't know when the big Ozai scenes, how much of the Ozai stuff is going to happen across the episodes. In one of the interviews, they said that, like, the Fire Nation, like, palace will just be a place we kind of return to episode upon episode. I get the impression that that means, like, we'll just see a bit of Ozai in nearly every episode. Like, he'll have 1 or 2 scenes here, but there won't be a specific episode that's maybe super Fire Nation focused until maybe, like, Zuko's backstory in perhaps, like, this episode, or maybe they do some of it here. Hard to say. But I'm just going to wrap up the video there by, again, asking the questions I want your guys' thoughts on in the comments, which is basically, what are your thoughts on the clearly extended Omashu group of episodes here, episode 3 and 4? What's happening here with this specific new group of characters? How do you think that's all going to play out? Questions like 108 and how the significance of what Roku's actually going to say to Aang, given that the Comet timing is not going to get brought up. What do you think that's about? And then masks, beyond just the Blue Spirit, what else is going to be in this episode? What are your thoughts on some of these key middle of the season changes? Prompted, of course, by just the format change, going from 22-minute episodes to 8 1-hour episodes. This is where a lot of the big stuff is going to happen that will, I suppose, really how people respond to these changes is going to be, like, key to what the general reaction is. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on that stuff below. But otherwise, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.